Okay.
Professor Nownes, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question.
Sure.
How do you view the growing influence of tech elites in shaping political agendas? Are they effectively becoming a new form of political aristocracy? How has the concentration of economic power among tech giants influenced the balance of political power in the United States? Could you discuss whether their dominance undermines or enhances democratic institutions?
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me here today. So I'm glad you phrased the first part of your question in that way. And I say this because you asked about agendas rather than policy outcomes. And the way I would answer it is I think there's no question that tech elites shape the political agenda. And we can start off, of course, with Elon Musk. I mean, he's the wealthiest man on earth and will receive media attention for pretty much whatever he does. And then, of course, there's his direct media involvement through Twitter. Well, I guess it's X now, and Instagram and other forums. And there's no question that his tweets, or whatever they're called now, and his media statements affect which issues people tend to think about. That doesn't mean, of course, that people will agree with what he says, but it does mean that people will see what he says and agree that the issues that he is talking about are important. And of course, Elon Musk is not alone. Many of the other tech elites have colossally large social media followings, Mark Zuckerberg and Reid Hoffman and Tim Cook and many others. So again, they may not always get what they want in terms of policy outcomes, but I don't think there's any question that the issues that they talk about publicly and choose to engage in are the issues that get public attention. And thusly, they do have a great deal of success in shaping the political agenda. Now, as for the second part of your question, in terms of the concentration of economic power, of course, these are very difficult questions to answer. And I think I'm probably more suited to address that part of your question as a citizen rather than a scholar. And I think that, anytime the government cedes too much power to private actors, this threatens democracy in some way. The government should and must work with private actors. I mean, after all, in a capitalist system, the health of the economy, of course, depends largely on the health of the private sector. But the government has its own role here, and at least theoretically, that's to look out for the rest of us. And I believe that ceding too much power to any private interest, the tech industry or any other private interest, is a threat to democracy. I think to sort of demonstrate this, I think you can see some of the perils of giving too much power to private actors in this so-called Doge Department that I don't know if you're all familiar with. This is the quasi-governmental body that Donald Trump has said he's already started to form, the Director of Government, the Department of Government Efficiency.
Yes.
I use air quotes here, the Department of Government Efficiency, because it's not actually a government department. Rather, again, it's a quasi-governmental or really non-governmental organization that Trump has tabbed Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to head, that is ostensibly designed to make government more efficient. And real government institutions, agencies, bureaucratic departments have rules and regulations about who they can hire, what sorts of behavior is and is not allowed at work, what sorts of qualifications a person must have to work in the department, and who the department is accountable to. And now let's imagine that this organization gets up and running, and in 6 months, Trump actually gives this new department some real power. There's really nothing to stop Elon Musk from making decisions that ensure, for example, his companies get lucrative government contracts while his competitors do not. Again, actual government departments have rules for things like this, conflict of interest rules, for example, and private organizations like this, a non-governmental organization, simply do not. So I think that is one of the more, to me, cogent examples of what could go wrong when you cede too much power to private actors in a democratic system.
Right. Looking at the historical relationship between corporate power and politics, how does the role of high-tech oligarchs compare to past industrial moguls in shaping American political landscapes? Is this a continuation of corporate influence, or does the unique nature of digital platforms present new challenges?
Okay, so to the first part of that question, I want to preface this by saying I'm not much of a historian, so I hesitate to say too much about how the current tech oligarchs and their companies compare to previous industries in American politics. But it's certainly not the case that this is the first time a powerful industry has seemed to exercise tremendous power over political outcomes in this country. So every school kid in this country, for example, learns about the robber barons of the Gilded Age here in the United States. And of course, the tobacco industry was extraordinarily politically powerful for decades and managed to stave off serious regulation of tobacco products. And of course, for the entirety of our history, doctors, the insurance industry, other healthcare providers have spent a tremendous amount of money and had a great deal of success lobbying against socialized medicine. So again, there's nothing new to the tech industry being powerful. This sort of corporate influence has been the case from the very beginning of the Republic. However, I think it's worth saying that the tech industry is different, I think, in a couple of respects from previous industries that were politically powerful. One is the just almost unfathomable resources that they have. Of course, the tech industry as a whole and even specific companies have much more money, many more resources than many nation states on Earth. This is unprecedented. In addition, these companies can now innovate so quickly that government and government agencies have a hard time keeping up. And so, for example, SpaceX is more capable currently than our government in engaging in space exploration. Alphabet and Google are far ahead of the United States government, and I think probably any other government on Earth when it comes to developing and deploying artificial intelligence. And this gives these companies, of course, tremendous influence over our lives, even if the influence is not directly political. So I do think the ascendance of the tech industry is different, and I think it raises a lot of new challenges that, frankly, we don't even know about yet. And let me give you an example to try to make my point about the power of the tech industry. So with the war in Ukraine and Russia, these companies are not directly involved in the war, of course, but they are affecting what's happening on the ground. So Microsoft, for example, protects Ukraine from cyber attacks. SpaceX keeps Ukrainians on the internet. I read recently that Google has removed images of Ukraine from its open source maps. These are the sorts of things that don't fit in well with how we conceptualize political power, but nonetheless have tremendous impact on real world political and international events. So I think in that sense, the power of tech over people's lives is unprecedented compared to the power of previous corporate interests.
Right. How do high-tech firms' lobbying activities compare to other industries in terms of expenditure and focus? Specifically, what does the dominance of issues like taxes, intellectual property, and technology indicate about their priorities in shaping US policy? How does this concentrated influence by a few tech giants affect policymaking transparency and public interest considerations?
Well, I mean, I certainly understand why media and ordinary people alike are focusing now on tech lobbying and the political influence of big tech. But I think it's important for people to realize that, big tech or the tech industry is just one of many industries in this country that spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year attempting to influence policy and elections. So there are a lot of other perennial heavyweight industries that spend on the order of as much as the tech industry does. And here I'm talking about, for example, the pharmaceutical industry, the health insurance industry, securities and investment companies, the oil and gas industry, and there are many, many more examples. So in that sense, the tech industry isn't that much different than any other sort of high-profile, very politically active industries. As for your last question, I think it's interesting the way that you phrased it, because I'm someone who studies what we call in this country public interest groups, or non-governmental organizations that consist of individual members. And at this point, there simply aren't that many of what I call public interest groups. Another term for them is citizen groups, working on the other side of issues that big tech is interested in. And in many other industries, there are such groups. So for example, in the oil and gas industry, there are hundreds of environmental groups in this country. Now, of course, they don't have the same resources that the oil and gas companies do, but they have managed to win a number of political victories over the last several decades. The healthcare companies and pharmaceutical companies have to contend with certain public interest groups that lobby against them on various issues, especially senior groups who are always lobbying about things like the cost of prescription drugs and certain government programs. And at this point, I do not see a lot of public interest groups or citizen groups working to blunt the power of big tech. And again, I think that this is another way in which this corporate sector is unusual.
What role do tech oligarchs play in shaping public discourse, and how do their personal ideologies influence the policies and practices of their platforms? Are we witnessing a new form of political lobbying through algorithmic creation or platform management?
Well, this question seems almost perfectly shaped to refer to Elon Musk, and certainly his personal ideology seems to affect every aspect of his newest company, X, or the former Twitter. And I think there's an element to this among the other tech moguls as well. It's a cliche, and though I do think it's accurate to say that a lot of these guys, even the ones that have traditionally supported center left or left causes and the Democratic Party, are at their core economic libertarians. They are libertarians on social issues as well, but their general sort of leave us alone and let us do what we want ethos seems to affect how they run their companies. And I'm especially thinking here of Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and X. It doesn't take too much time spent on these platforms to realize that it's a pretty libertarian ethos that seems to permeate what happens on these platforms. As for your second question, I'm not really sure I know enough about algorithms and platform management to say much about this. I can say this, however, it seems to me that the conservative criticism that a lot of these companies were attracting during the first Trump administration did seem to affect some of the things they were doing. For example, content moderation in labeling certain things misinformation and disinformation, as well as their decisions about who to platform and who to deplatform. So I do think there is some evidence that algorithmic curation, as you put it, and platform management is having some effect politically.
Given the rise of misinformation and polarization on social media platforms, do you believe tech companies bear responsibility for mitigating these issues, or should this be addressed through government regulation? How do you balance such regulation with the principles of free speech?
Well, I think I'm not sure that this was how the question was intended, but I will answer it this way anyway. Again, as a citizen more than a scholar, I think that the social media companies absolutely bear some responsibility for the explosion of misinformation and disinformation in this country. And of course, they don't see it that way. But I think the evidence is overwhelming that they have contributed to the epidemic of misinformation and disinformation in this country and elsewhere. I think no matter how one feels about government regulation, it seems to me that there's really only one organization in this country that is large enough, powerful enough, and well-resourced enough to actually rein in these companies, and that's the federal government. Of course, the EU has that power too. But the companies have shown very little commitment to doing anything about misinformation or disinformation. And so I see the mere idea of self-regulation as a bit of a non-starter. And again, as for the free speech aspect of it, I don't think it's particularly hard to balance regulation with free speech. I mean, we do it all the time, for example, with tobacco. And I think the free speech defense of the way that social media companies conduct themselves is somewhat nonsensical. We regulate things all the time without infringing on people's rights to say and do things.
Right. Do you think the political donations and lobbying efforts by Silicon Valley's tech executives disproportionately sway policy outcomes? Are there examples where their influence has significantly impacted legislation and political campaigns, with federal campaign finance laws being described as Byzantine and ever-changing? What challenges do these laws pose in regulating the contributions of tech leaders, and how can these challenges be addressed without infringing on free speech rights?
Okay, so before I sort of address this question directly, I want to point out, and again, I'm sure a lot of the people who might watch this or listen to this understand this, that for people like me who study interest groups, and especially for people who study interest group influence or corporate influence or lobbying influence or whatever you want to call these things, we have a very difficult job. And I say that because it's virtually impossible to prove influence. There are many reasons for this, but probably the most important is because the old saw about how correlation does not equal causation is correct. And so, for example, in this country, we see the gun lobby makes huge contributions to right-leaning politicians. And then as soon as these politicians are in office, they do everything that they can do to make sure that we have access to firearms. But the fact that they do what the groups want them to do doesn't show influence, because there's plenty of evidence that these politicians probably would have behaved that way in the absence of the gun lobby giving them money and campaigning for them. And in fact, that's the reason the gun lobby is giving them money in the first place. So my point here is that finding influence, determining policy influence is very difficult. And thusly, it's very difficult to conclude one way or another about how much influence any group or sector or set of individuals might have over policy outcomes. So about the best we can do is sort of guess based on the best evidence that we have. This said, I think it's pretty clear to me, at least, that the tech industry, like many other industries in this country, has been quite politically influential. The thing that pops into my mind most obviously is the social media companies in particular have spent quite a long time on campaigns in the states and at the federal level to maintain Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is a very famous piece of legislation here that actually protects online platforms from being treated as publishers and thus grants them virtual legal immunity for whatever happens on their sites. This is very unusual for any industry in the United States to basically be legally immunized for their behavior. And of course, they've done a very good job of making sure that Section 230 is not seriously modified or revoked entirely. There's a number of other policy victories that come to mind. I think, for example, Uber and Lyft spent big money a couple of years ago against Proposition 22 in California, which ended up actually exempting the companies from labor laws in the state, even a famously liberal state like that. Big tech and Amazon have been quite successful in staving off legislation designed to inform users about how the companies use their data. And of course, in terms of the influence of individual tech leaders, I think Peter Thiel is, I'm not going to say almost solely responsible for the ascendance of J.D. Vance, but certainly played a huge role in that. So I do think there's plenty of evidence for to support the hypothesis that these companies and their leaders are quite influential. As for the second part of your question about campaign finance laws, I think it's essential for people to realize that campaign finance laws in this country, as they are currently configured, really can't stop an individual or an organization from pumping as much money as they want into our campaign finance system. Yes, there are regulations, and yes, the regulations can and do stop the uber rich and well-resourced organizations from donating money directly to candidates for office. But the way the laws are currently configured, and I don't see this changing anytime soon, there's nothing the government nor anyone else can do to stop a person or an organization from spending unlimited sums of money to support the candidates or parties they support. So, for example, Elon Musk contributed something like, well, I've seen various estimates between $200 and $300 million to try to help Trump get elected. He's not allowed to give that money to Trump. The amount that he can give to Trump is severely limited, but he is allowed to give this money to a super PAC. And in this case, he gave it to his own super PAC, America PAC. All he had to do is hire a decent lawyer or two to make sure that they followed the letter of the law. And there was nothing to stop him from pumping, again, unlimited sums of money into this election. I see no evidence at all that either major political party has any appetite to change anything about the current system. So at this point, I see the question of regulating this sort of spending as rather moot. I do not see that in the cards at all.
You discuss super citizens leveraging their wealth and public profiles to influence policy through media and social platforms. How do you see this form of direct advocacy evolving, especially with the growing influence of social media as an unmediated channel?
Well, I'm a kind of notoriously bad prognosticator about the future of politics, and I don't think I know enough about technology to offer a really good answer to that question. But I will say, when I thought about this a little bit, excuse me, one of the things I did notice in terms of this concept of super citizens that my co-author and I, Darren Halpin, thought about was that more and more people, especially younger people and especially younger men, are getting all of their news, not just some of it, but all of it, from people who are not really in the news business. And by this, I mean people like Joe Rogan and Theo Von, these tremendously popular podcasters who are sort of what we call prototypical super citizens, people that became famous through their non-political activity, but are now having enormous political influence via their podcast. I think the extent to which people get their news from these sources and from these people is a little bit underappreciated. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this moving forward as traditional media or legacy media continue to recede in importance and in some cases die altogether. And unfortunately, I think that disinformation and misinformation will become even more of a problem because of that.
Your book suggests that Silicon Valley philanthropy tends to favor post-material causes, such as environmental conservation and arts, over redistributive efforts that address economic inequality. What implications does this trend have for addressing structural inequalities in American society?
Well, the first part of the question asks about disproportionate funding for certain issues. I think the best example I can think of in terms of a policy issue is education. And in short, our research showed that Silicon Valley types and their foundations spent a great deal of money in this country over the last couple of decades on education, what they called reforms, which were things like charter schools and privatization, voucher schemes, things like that. And there's plenty of evidence that this advocacy, and in some cases direct funding of advocacy, seeped into state policy and school districts throughout the United States. So I think that Silicon Valley Titans companies and foundations putting their money into certain issues rather than others definitely has some impact. Again, though, it's difficult to prove definitively. I also think that the disproportionate funding that we see on what you called post material issues, I think the implications of that are tremendous. And the main implications is that, certain issues, including seemingly intractable problems in the United States, like income inequality, homelessness, underemployment, poverty, lack of access to good healthcare, are simply not a very big part of our political discourse. To be a liberal in the 1930s in this country meant elevating the day-to-day economic. And today, as per the political activities of a lot of left-leaning Silicon Valley types, it means focusing on issues like abortion and DEI programs, LGBTQ rights, and occasionally global warming. And I think one consequence of all this is that the center left in this country and its political party home, the Democrats, have ceded ground on economic issues to right-wing populists like Donald Trump. He doesn't talk about these issues in a particularly serious way, but at least he discusses them. At least he speaks to them. And you don't see a lot in his rhetoric or in his plan about doing anything about structural inequalities, but at least he's talking about issues. And I think that the center-left focus almost entirely on these post-material issues has been disastrous for the working class in this country, but it also helps explain the victory of Donald Trump and lots of other MAGA Republicans. As for current political tendencies, I think you asked about, I think there's no question that a handful of high-profile tech types, again, Elon Musk being the prototype, have turned to Trump and to the right. It also seems that there are others who, even if they disagree with Trump on a lot of things and didn't vote for him, have softened their rhetoric toward him. And I'm thinking of Zuckerberg and Bezos here, of people who I don't know if they've necessarily voted for Trump, but they've certainly issued a number of conciliatory statements. I don't see any evidence from voting records and campaign finance records that Silicon Valley employees, rank and file people, or even high-level executives have turned Trumpian or right-wing populists in force. Yes, there have been some defections, but San Jose, California, Silicon Valley in general are still overwhelmingly Democratic and identify as liberal. But I think that some high-profile names have definitely turned toward Trump. I think that they haven't changed that much. Politics has changed a lot, and I think that's why we see, for example, even though a lot of Silicon Valley employees, again, the rank and file employees at these companies, haven't changed that much, they are certainly more silent than they were 8 or 10 years ago. And I think some of the stuff you're hearing from the tech titans, the entrepreneurs, the owners, the founders themselves, is sheer pragmatism. They understand Trump's the president, and this time they want to get out in front of it. And as far as employees, I think they see how the world has changed, and that frankly, there's really no reason for them to engage in a ton of protests because A, probably won't do any good, and B, they could actually get in trouble at work. So that was a bit of a rambling answer, but that's yeah.
Given the discussion on the erosion of public trust in tech firms due to scandals like Cambridge Analytica, what role do you think transparency and ethical considerations should play in maintaining the political capital of these companies?
Well, I think it's quite interesting given how much influence tech companies have and how closely Donald Trump has tethered himself to Elon Musk, that public opinion polls in this country are very clear that the vast majority of Americans are quite skeptical about, and in most cases even negative about, tech companies. So I talk about tech companies a little bit in my class on lobbying here, and I found a Pew study from earlier this year that showed that 78% of Americans in surveys say that social media companies wield too much political power. And to me, this is an astonishing number because so far, given the vast majority, or given this public opinion reality. The companies do not seem to have paid much of a price politically or even economically. But I think this might be changing. And I think this might have something to do with the turn to the right of some of the leaders of these companies. So what am I thinking about here? Well, I haven't heard too many people talking about this recently, but bear with me for a second. First of all, sort of quietly over the last couple of years, multiple states in this country have passed age verification laws for pornographic websites. And I think this hasn't gotten a ton of media attention, but I think that social media companies are looking around and saying, if they're doing this to them, might they start thinking about doing something similar to us? That is, there's a growing discourse in this country, a growing dialogue about how bad social media are, for example, for children. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a very high-selling book called The Anxious Generation about all the negative impacts of social media, especially on children. And I think this is beginning to seep into our political discourse for a while. And I think that these companies are going to have to start paying attention to some of the ethical considerations that you reference in this question. And I also think that they're looking around at some of the dabbling and, for example, again, regulating pornographic sites. I think they're looking at that and thinking that they're going to have to start paying a little bit more attention to some of these issues, definitely.
And lastly, Professor Nownes, how do you think American institutions will react to second Trump administration? There are those pundits arguing that American democracy may not survive another Trump term.
Well, this is a this is a tough question, and for professional and personal reasons, I think I will say, do I think American democracy will survive? Yes, I do. What will it look like in a few years from now? I don't know. I see some disturbing signs. I think in terms of democratic norms, I think we've seen many of those take quite a hit over the last few years. The legal system has been quite slow to catch up with some of the stuff, especially some of the attempts by the president-elect to change the outcome of the last election. But I think that's an open question. I wish I had a good answer, but at this point, I just don't know.
Professor Nownes, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate that you asking me the questions. Thank you so much.